So welcome to this session on AI horizons and the future of AI and the implications for finance. Throughout today, you'll be hearing a great deal about these topics, and I'm sure also you've been talking about it in your coffee break too. So we would like to use the session to set the scene and also to stimulate some of your thinking. While AI has been around for almost as long as the modern computing era, I'm sure you'll agree that in the last 18 months, it has been both different and remarkable. The release of ChatGPT and its counterparts has not just captured the popular imagination, but has shown us that the space of possibilities for AI may be bigger than we expected and may arrive sooner than we anticipated. It has also started to reveal new risks that were not previously apparent. These innovations have already had significant economic impacts, particularly on the allocation of investment capital and the growing role of big tech firms. There is widespread speculation, as well as serious research, suggesting that AI technology will have a profound long-term impact on economic productivity, the nature of the workforce, and the structure of the economy. However, there have also been short-term disappointments, with AI-driven productivity gains proving to be not as easy to realize or as safe as many has hoped. Whether AI unfolds as a marathon or a sprint in the times ahead, it seems clear that it's here to stay and we'll have to adapt to it. It also seems clear that there are many new innovations ahead. The industry is abuzz with speculation about artificial general intelligence, or AGI, and autonomous agents, and I'm sure we'll touch on those two things later. The physical world is also set to change, with self-driving cars and physical robots finally coming of age. So, we face an exciting yet uncertain future. What does the horizon look like? And what are the implications for finance in particular? I don't have any crystal balls up here on stage, but I have two brilliant panelists. I'm delighted to welcome Jeremie Harris and Emily Prince to our discussion. Jeremie is the co-founder and CEO of Gladstone AI, a company that collaborates with researchers at the world's top AI labs and with US national security agencies to address extreme risks from AI. Gladstone recently carried out the first ever assessment of catastrophic AI risk commissioned by the US government. Jeremie is also the co-host of the popular Last Week in AI podcast, which discusses the latest news and research on this rapidly evolving topic. I suspect you may be one of the most informed people on the planet when it comes to industry developments in AI, Jeremie, so it's a privilege to have you here today. I'm also delighted to welcome Emily Prince to the stage. Emily is the Group Head of Analytics and CEO of Yieldbook at the London Stock Exchange Group. Emily is responsible for analytics and AI customer solutions and leads the group's strategic AI partnership with Microsoft. Emily has 20 years of experience in financial services at institutions including Lehman Brothers, RBS, Barclays, and BlackRock, and holds board positions with Turquoise and Finborn. It's a privilege to have such an experienced AI practitioner from the financial services industry here with us today. So I'm going to start with you, Emily. Over the last 18 months, we have all heard sensational stories about the potential of AI and seen a significant amount of jumping on the bandwagon. It has often been hard to separate the hype from reality. So as a practitioner in the financial services sector, can you give us some examples of what AI can do and is enabling us to do that we couldn't do before?
Happy to. And first of all, it is a great honor to be here today and on such an esteemed panel. So I think the first thing to say is I'm not a romantic when it comes to AI. I think I'm very much in the practical of how do we make it genuinely transformative for financial services. And that is something that I personally subscribe to. The potential of AI can be enormous. And just as we were noting, there are a lot of things for us to consider, to get right, to make that true. But when we think about the potential, it is enormous. And what do I mean by that? Let's take some examples. When we think today that financial services is often regarded as one of the biggest generators of information, but how easy is it to consume information in financial services? Each of us in this room generate extraordinary amounts of intelligence, of information, and our predecessors have as well. But our ability to use that information and consume that information is limited to our own ability to focus within a day, the hours that we have in a day, the distractions we have in our phone, our children asking for food, whatever the case may be. And so when we think about context windows that are presented with AI and the ability to surface much more information, much more can start to be achieved. And we can start to notice trends across data sets that we would never have been able to see before. The second thing, and this is one that is very close to my heart, is that historically in financial services, there have been all sorts of barriers to access information. Sometimes those were, can you code? Sometimes they were, can you speak English? There are all sorts of barriers that exist within financial services. And one of the things that we start to see, and this is real, these are products we're building today, are chat interfaces that allow us to just ask a question and interact directly with an API. Now, just to settle on that, that might not sound radical, but that is hugely transformative when you think about the barriers to interacting with an API for so many participants across financial services today. The third thing is clearly that when we start to think about how we interact with information, that can bring about huge efficiencies. I think rarely a day goes by when I don't hear from someone, if only I had a bit more time. And so what we're starting to do is to really nurture people to be able to focus on the things where we add the greatest value and start to think about how we bring the right level of automation where it makes sense to. And that is a stepwise thing that we need to get right. But bringing those things together, when we have an unlimited access to information that we can really interrogate in a way that we can consume and use, and it is accessible to everyone, when we put those things together, that is transformative for financial services.
Great. And, you know, I know you've been very busy with your own kind of proofs of concept and maybe even some production applications. So, you know, in those so far, have you found that the technology, you know, generative AI in particular, has lived up to the hype?
I think the reality is most people resurface the issues they already knew they had in the organization. And a lot of those things that were niggling in terms of how the data was organized, how it was structured, the degree to which it's labeled, those things are coming back and in some examples being amplified. So I think if you take a balanced approach in saying, where am I today? And then a very focused view on which problems am I trying to solve for? I think you get it about right. I think if you approach it with saying, AI is going to solve for everything. In a utopian state, it will do everything. There's no need to do anything. I think you're going to be living in maybe a land where the hype is not reconciling with reality.
Great. So Jeremie, you've often spoken about the phenomena of moving goalposts, where people that are skeptical about AI advances express doubt that some huge milestone can be achieved, and then as soon as it's achieved, they shift the goalpost and express doubt about the next innovation. So do you think that what has been achieved to date in AI and more recently with Gen AI has been genuinely transformational, and the skeptics are indeed just shifting goalposts, or are we yet to see the real breakthroughs, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, excuse me, I think it's the question that everybody's trying to wrestle with right now. I do want to, by the way, just thank everybody for being here and for the invitation, you, Chris, and Christina as well. Really appreciate being here, and it's such an important time to be having these kinds of conversations. Yeah, I think when it comes to our expectations of the technology, you know, I'm old enough to remember when it was a big deal to have an AI system that could speak to you in such compelling terms as to convince you that it was a human being, right? That was known as the Turing test. For many people, that was the magical bar where they said, well, I'll believe we're on course to build human-level AI when we finally, you know, beat the Turing test. That happened a few years ago. Now, you know, we're on to the next thing. For 5 minutes. Yeah, that's right. And then the next thing, you know, for some, and it varies from person to person. Some people said things like, I don't know, I'll believe that we're on to human-level AI, kind of that nominal trajectory, if AI can, you know, solve open problems in math. That happened about 6 months ago. If AI can, I don't know, make material advances in fields like material sciences. That happened about 3 months ago. We now live in a world where more and more of these barriers, and we always, by the way, find ways to rationalize those after the fact. Oh, it wasn't such a hard problem after all. It turns out, no, I can tell you how this was solved. It's the damnedest thing. It's just this artificial neuron connected to that artificial neuron and the activations, all this stuff. And you're like, well, yeah, but I could explain the human brain in those same terms and trivialize the whole thing as well. None of which is to say that these are not valid points to some degree. Some amount of goalpost shifting is actually to be expected. Right? We build new technologies, we learn, oh, shoot, the thing that we thought was really hard was actually kind of easy. We got that for free. This other thing became the real bottleneck. And so I think a large part of the tension right now in the field is assessing how much of that is legitimate goalpost shifting, how much of it is maybe something we ought to be a little bit more attentive to. And I think one last kind of flag to plant here is we're starting to get, and Emily hinted at this, we're starting to get a bit of a sense for some of the metrics that might actually map onto human level intelligence, like the full-on promise of the technology. I think one of them, again, this is one that Emily referenced, this idea of context windows. Right? Essentially, this is roughly the amount or the number of thoughts that an AI system can hold in its head at any given time. Like back in 2020, that number was about a short essay worth. Now, 2 years later, it was about half a book's worth. Now it's about 10 million words worth, right? So as you start to increase the size of those context windows, you can start to imagine plugging in the totality of all your corporate documents, articles of incorporation, customer lists, product ideas, everything, into one system that can parse and reason kind of effectively about that data. So I think that's an interesting metric that it's difficult to separate that from an approach to something like human level or even super intelligent AI.
Okay, so breakthroughs have definitely been made then, I guess you're arguing. And going back to the financial services setting, to Emily, while the power of the models has been steadily increasing, we know that they are hard to implement in practice, in particular in a regulated financial services context, where we need to protect both markets and consumers as well. And there are all sorts of regulatory requirements. So could you share a bit about some of those challenges and what you see are the challenges currently and maybe upcoming in implementing AI in the real world?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think for me personally, I always start with the use case. Which problem are we solving? And being very clear about that and also challenging how we've necessarily prescribed use cases in the past. Jeremie and I were talking in the past. We were very particular around defining personas as part of use cases. And we're finding that doesn't necessarily hold as strong and true in the context of AI. So the first thing is define that use case, define it very, very clearly. And out of that, we can really start to think about what are the things that we need to untangle? Where do we need the abstractions? Where do we need the controls? Where do we need the humans? Where do we need those control points, in other words? And when we start to look at the picture from that perspective, the problem becomes a little bit more bite-sized in a way that, well, we do have a lot of model regulation as a financial service community. And there are a lot of lessons that we can glean in terms of model monitoring, in terms of model suitability, that we can garner from some of those precedences. We also know that with things like DORA, there's a lot of considerations around data and how data is presented and the topology of data and the trustworthiness of data. So again, we have a framework that we can lean into and start to think about how do we put the right guardrails around those. And so what I'm describing is it becomes really a jigsaw where we can start to look at the whole ecosystem and in respect to the problem we're solving, start to make sure that we've got the right frameworks and guardrails. Where I see the challenge is where people don't necessarily have some of those pieces in place. And so for the people who maybe didn't have a model infrastructure or didn't have a model risk management framework in place, it starts to become a bigger lift to be able to get to the right level of control. And I think that's where having a very considered approach of what use case are you solving for, and then which pieces do you need to build yourself and which pieces do you need a framework around and partnership is an extremely important set of decisions to make. I think once you put that in place, you can actually achieve a lot in a very safe and measured way. I think the model implementation is becoming arguably easier. Where I see the greatest challenges is in scale. Consistently, I see problems from a customer perspective around people trying to scale their AI solutions. They can stand up a nice little prototype, but when it comes to running in a scalable way, that resurfaces. The second one comes back to how their data has been organized, structured consistently. And that has also ramifications in terms of when you're trying to reduce the levels of hallucinations. And then third, one of the things that I see commonly is when people are starting to implement AI, there's often a lack of literacy. We talk a lot about financial literacy, AI literacy. What is true? What is myth? And there's a lot of hype, and the media is helping to bring in a lot of hype and energy into things that may be true in certain specific examples, may not be true as general. And so one of the things, and Jeremie and I have actually been speaking about this, how do we make sure that there's the right level of knowledge, understanding, so that those right informed decisions can be made at the outset?
And one of the very specific kind of risks that gets highlighted in the financial services setting is often explainability, right? So what are these models doing, and a demand that they are somehow transparent. Do you think that's even achievable? And if it's not, how big a problem is that?
I'll say it has to be. So, and I think this comes back to the use cases again. Having explainability and understanding of the model that is being used to solve a particular problem and whether you've got the right level of explainability for that problem is something we're all accountable for making sure is true. One of the things that I've spent some time on is thinking about, we have traditional models and we have these probabilistic kind of approaches. We have pricing models that do hedging, that generate risk sensitivities on a daily basis across the industry. They're model validated, they're governed, there's very firm kind of frameworks around those models. I see an interlock between those where the LLM is effectively acting like a relay, sending signals, messages across, triggering an action to happen within one of those deterministic models, not replacing it. Because within those deterministic models, we have a long precedence of explaining what they're doing. They might not be the best models. Funnily enough, the probabilistic model may give a better answer, but can we explain it and prove it? So I think this is going to be one of those areas where, as AI evolves, we will see transitions where some problems may never get solved for, where we always feel like we need a deterministic approach, and where in other instances it is appropriate. I think we're quite far into, we'll use it as a relay for now, gathering, but we won't make decisions.
Thank you. So let's move to the future. Jeremie, part of the work you do is to track AI innovation and industry developments, which you discuss in your podcast, Last Week in AI. Over the last 18 months, we've seen a continuous stream of new developments, including the release of increasingly powerful large language models. There are rumors that the new version of ChatGPT will be released imminently. Many of the foundational AI labs are openly working on a mission of artificial general intelligence, or AGI as it's called. So could you start by giving us all an idea and a potted summary of what AGI is?
Yeah, I mean, we've got like 5 minutes. To tie this in as well, I think to the picture Emily very expertly laid out there of the sort of the hype versus the reality versus the fiction. Both things are kind of true at the same time, right? We can be approaching these very powerful systems while at the same time in regulated environments, right, where reliability is really key. You just have a couple of killer features that are absent and it just nukes the whole thing, right? So there's this question about, yes, like on a path, but when, for what application? So I think that's a really important kind of ingredient to all this, and Emily's really right to point that out. So yeah, AGI, okay, human level AI, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. The one thing I can tell you is nobody has any agreement on what these terms actually mean. So we can just be hand-wavy about this, and I'm about to be, so I apologize. But it's essentially the idea, if you look at OpenAI, roughly their definition is something like an AI system that can do all human productive labor, right? Something like this. That may sound far-fetched. It sounds increasingly less far-fetched as time goes on. It certainly sounds much less far-fetched today than it did in 2020, certainly than it did in 2016. So I think one of the core feeders, one of the core things that makes people think that we may be on that trajectory is that the inputs to AI, the equation behind intelligence seems to have dramatically simplified in the last 4 years. Right? So we've kind of come about this realization that you don't actually have to have a crazy clever artificial brain to make these things work. That used to be the thesis. We'll come up with essentially a bunch of software engineers / neuroscientists who are going to come up with this very clever way of architecting these artificial brains. And then in 2020, OpenAI, with the precursor to ChatGPT, they essentially showed that, well, actually, if you just take the same techniques that have been kind of working this whole time and scale them up, right? Train these neural networks with way more data, way more processing power. And here we're talking about tens of millions of dollars in just processors alone, billions of dollars even. You get a reliable increase in intelligence out. So you sort of have this equation that at the macro level it boils down to, where you have kind of dollars in one end, IQ points out the other, to roughly kind of oversimplify. That is the picture of the world as far as OpenAI is concerned, as far as Google DeepMind is concerned, as far as Microsoft is concerned. Microsoft today is engaged in the single largest infrastructure build-out in human history. In human history. $50 billion a year on data center infrastructure alone. $200 billion for the Apollo moon landing, so in 4 years we get there. This is only increasing. That's on the thesis explicitly. The scaling trajectory leads us to this sort of AGI universe. So broadly, AGI, what is it? I don't know. No one else can tell you, so at least that's one thing. But it certainly is something that's damn important, and we should all be talking about it.
Very good. And you kind of highlighted it there, right, with Microsoft, with the, investing in these huge infrastructure farms. Could you give us a bit more on that, a bit more color, like across the industry, like so with this equation of just money and kind of resources in, it's hardware, I guess it's also energy as well. So how is this playing out at the moment, and how kind of intense is that, drive to accumulate these resources? Yeah,
well, so if the equation really does, if what I told you is true, and I don't know if I hope that it is, but certainly I hope I'm not lying to you, then a couple of things immediately become true as corollaries, right? So first, access to these AI hardware, AI processors becomes the key ingredient, right? This is your path to human level intelligence. This is your path to trillions of dollars, tens of trillions, I don't know how many trillions of dollars in value, right? So you got to get your hands on advanced AI processors. Who builds those? Well, it's pretty much NVIDIA today. There are competitors popping up, but NVIDIA has 95% market share. That's why they've been in the news. That's why their stock is doing so well. Everybody wants to get their hands on these things. Above them in the supply chain, kind of earlier on, you have the manufacture of these AI hardware components. So NVIDIA designs them, but they get manufactured in Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and others. So everybody's trying to get their arms on these tools, these semiconductors, and build more, right? That's why the CHIPS Act came about in the United States, $50 billion for just domestic kind of onshoring of semiconductor fabs. We're seeing that happen around the world. Other reasons for that, but it is in large part driven by this race to scale. I think really it's the smart money right now is pushing increasingly in this direction. And hardware is one component. But then to run the hardware, as you said, you need energy. And today, depending on the area you think about, so in the United States, we've got all the hardware we can eat, roughly, but energy is a big, big issue, right? So to train their latest model, OpenAI had to use something on the order of like a week worth of New York City's power consumption, right? Like that's the order of magnitude that we're talking about. People freaking out about Bitcoin, well, this is on a trajectory like that, so we're at New York City today, where else is it gonna be in the future? So there's a huge requirement for energy infrastructure. In other countries like China, it's almost the reverse. Right, so there you have a sort of shortage of hardware, a lot of energy infrastructure. So the bottlenecks differ depending on the area that you look at. Yeah.
Good, thank you. And so let's turn to like what AGI or something like that, or whatever that might mean in a kind of business context. And so, while many firms are successfully deploying AI in predictive models and more recently in chatbots, AI is still obviously a long way off from being able to automate business processes at scale. I think we'll all agree with that. Sam Altman actually said himself that while AGI could be developed soon, it will change the world much less than we all think and change jobs much less than we all think. His reasoning appears to be that people and businesses are slow to change, regardless of the technology. So my question to you, Emily, is as AI models get increasingly more powerful, do you think we will see a large-scale automation of activities currently performed by humans?
I think before we get to automation, there are quite a few other steps that are hugely important, if not more important. And I'll leave the kind of full automation point almost lingering because I'm not sure if it matters, funnily enough. If we focus first on what is the benefit of humans to be able to benefit from the right information at the right point in time. Like imagine right now, based on a thought, based on your intent, you're presented with the right information to make for the best decision. That is so powerful for humans to make the best decisions. And I see that as the first step. So it is very much, how do we surface the right information based on the intent of someone? And you're already seeing it within things like ChatGPT. What you haven't really seen at scale is that in a financial context, but you will. And as that starts to surface, that will really systematically support better decision making, but also allow for many people to have better access to services than they have today. One of the reasons we aren't able to give everyone the same and equal level of service is we simply can't practically do it. This lowers the barriers in a way that becomes much more real. So that's the first one for me. The second one is much on the assistant side, and you see that with a lot of the kind of productivity themes like co-pilots and so forth. I do think you will see the benefit of certain tasks being presented more quickly and with much greater auditability, importantly for this industry, as a result of things like that. That can be a stepwise change. I don't know how much people will sympathize with this. I have spent too much of my career building things in Excel, and then picking up other people's macros and trying to unpick them. I mean, it's torture, truly torture. So, those are some of the types of things that we can solve for in a much more systematic, auditable way. I think when it comes to augmentation, and deliberately go in that order, that is a little bit further, and we haven't yet defined enough the rules of the game. But what we are seeing is where we can say, that person is trying to solve for that problem, how can we augment them in a way that does make them more efficient and allows for them to focus on where we really need critical thoughts? We're starting to see very early examples of that. But I think that will be the slowest moving, because that is where we need to think about this fabric of financial services and how we make sure we reinstate the right decision rights, but also the right level of accountability and scrutiny. So insights, then we'll see the assistance increasingly, and then ultimately augmentation. I think we're some way away from full automation today.
Even with the insights, though, what you're suggesting, I think with some confidence, right, if I'm reading you correctly, is that actually just through the insights alone, that can have a pretty transformational impact on businesses. So could you give us a glimpse of like what that kind of means, and what businesses might, maybe as your own or just more generally, right, more abstractly, what should we be thinking about in terms of that future and what it brings for staff?
Let me actually do it with an example. So what were the trends in the fund industry last year? Some of you may know that question intuitively, and others may be inclined to look somewhere. Where are you looking? Now, in there lies the truth that we're all going to look at different sources. Maybe some people don't actually have access to be able to source that information, and your go-to is Google. Maybe Google's right. Maybe. But the point is, you're not looking at a verified source of information. And so the likelihood that you're going to pick up false information is now greater. Not necessarily true, but possible. And so being able to source what were the trends within the fund industry last year, and then go further and say, tell me the top performing funds last year. And tell me where I can invest within those funds. And tell me a little bit more about the risk characteristics. But I don't really like investing in X. Tell me where I can find something that better suits my intent as an individual to have something that I'm invested in that most matches my interests, my risk profile. What I just described there probably involved many different people, many different systems, and certainly many instances where the data will not reconcile. So it is fraught today with inconsistencies. The product we've actually already built enables you to go end to end in those questions with a question in French, in Spanish, in Japanese, in English. So the ability to surface the right information to people has just got a lot more easy to achieve. Very powerful.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to risks and safety. And I know, Jeremie, this is one of your favorite topics. So many of the world's governments and public authorities have recently intensified the attention to the risks posed by what so-called advanced AI systems. As part of this, your own company recently published a report on the safety and security of advanced AI, which was commissioned by the US State Department, and you surveyed 200 experts from leading AI labs. So people in the audience may have heard of something called alignment risk. Again, can you briefly explain what that is and what you think can be done to address it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I mean, we've touched on it already, but any conversation of the risks of AI has to be coupled to a conversation about the benefits. So I'll park the benefits piece because the question is about the risks. But just to highlight, I mean, Emily's already surfaced a whole bunch of opportunities that are being created by this stuff. So be remiss not to flag that. This is just it's a multi-headed hydra. We have to look at both sides of the coin here. Yeah. So on the risk piece, alignment is this really interesting challenge. I guess the best language I could give here for this audience is maybe Goodhart's law, right? So let's think about how an AI system is actually trained. You take this blob of intelligence, let's not get bogged down in details. You get it to do a thing. It fails at first. Then you mess with that blob of intelligence and you try again. And through a glorified process of trial and error, eventually it gets good at the task. What does getting good at the task mean? It means some number that you care about goes up. Right? That's the training process. I want you to maximize for the number of upvotes that you get from human reviewers. That's how ChatGPT was sort of fine-tuned at the end, right? Get humans to upvote and downvote, roughly speaking, its outputs. Great, that's the number you're making go up. Okay, what do we know about Goodhart's law? If you pick a number, any number, and then you turn it into a target of optimization, that number ceases to measure what it used to measure, right? So GDP. GDP looks like a great thing to kind of optimize for, right? It's correlated to well-being. When GDP is high, we're all doing well. Let's maximize the crap out of GDP, right? What immediately happens? People find ways to hack it. You can do all kinds of things. You can borrow money. You do all kinds of things that are not necessarily good long-term to sustain the economy growth, but that do succeed at growing that number, right? In the same way, if an AI system gets dangerously creative, it can find ways to achieve its programmed objective, in other words, to make that number go up, that have side effects that none of us anticipated. They can use strategies that are dangerously creative, but that no one told it not to pursue because we never thought of them in the first place. And ultimately, that's kind of the problem with intelligence is we want these systems desperately to come up with new strategies that we didn't think of. That is, in some meaningful sense, the entire point. That's what this artificial intelligence is for. We couldn't solve the problem, and so we're commissioning an AI to solve it for us. Who are we to get upset when it does it the wrong way, right? So this is the challenge. The current paradigm, the way we train these systems as giant number go up machines, to use the Bitcoin maximalist framing, is not actually conducive to always getting sort of safe, reliable, trustworthy outputs, right? So ChatGPT at root, what is it? It's a text autocomplete engine. It was trained by being fed sentences from the internet and just completing the next sentence over and over and over again. Well, that means it cares about predicting the next word. It doesn't care about being truthful or helpful or harmless or honest. It cares about predicting the next word. That's why it's so easy to jailbreak these systems into revealing these weird behaviors, into spouting conspiracy theories or whatever. If you prime them with the right sentence that puts it in that mindset that, oh, I'm auto-completing a sentence from a conspiracy theory website. So here's the output, right? So at the end of the day, that's the challenge. We don't know how to come up with metrics that we can train these systems to optimize for that are aligned with what we actually want them to do. And so we create perverse optimizers. And every AI system in the world today is an example of that, and that's why there's so many weird edge cases with them.
Do you see progress? I mean, there's been talk about this for 18 months or more, and yet really bad things, touch wood, don't seem to have happened yet. But and the labs seem to be responding, right? So are you, maybe I don't know if this is the right question, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about alignment and the kind of progress being made towards addressing it?
Yeah, well, I guess I should probably just mention the kind of the Endgame scenario that's frankly just like the everyday water cooler conversation at the Frontier Labs today. And when we spoke to, you referenced it, but sort of hundreds of these folks, it was really clear where they see it going by default if we don't come up with countermeasures. And hopefully we will, and there's reason for optimism. But if you train a system that is looking to optimize something even slightly different from what you're after, and you give it a wide enough action space, and it's a clever enough system, there's no particular circumstance, it's really hard to think of one where the system is better off pursuing whatever that objective is if it gets turned off. There's no circumstance in which it's more likely to achieve its trained objective if it has access to fewer resources or less control over its environment. And so, in that sense, baked into the premise of modern AI is this incentive for what is known in the technical AI literature as power seeking. I mean, that is the language that's used. It reflects the sort of risk class that people are worried about as these things get more kind of freedom of action. There's a lot of research going on right now, especially on the interpretability side. And weirdly enough, this actually does tie into some of the explainability questions, right? We want our AIs to be able to explain to us what they're thinking, what their plans are, in human understandable terms. And so there's this issue that alignment may seem like a very far future concern. It manifests today in these weird ways where we have chatbots who will hallucinate, who will give us conspiratorial answers to questions, all those sorts of things. Where this goes long term is potentially sort of fairly intense, but the tools that we develop along the way may pay dividends, right? The explainable AI stuff. There's debate about what constitutes an explanation, by the way, which I'm sure Emily can speak to very deeply. But these techniques are hopefully going to scale as the systems do too. And I think there's a lot of room for concern. It's certainly not the default course that we're on right now, but if we can make progress in those key areas, I think we'll be in a good spot.
Okay, and I've got to ask one more scary question, and then I promise no more. In a recent interview with Time magazine, you stated that AI labs are engaged in a game of Russian roulette with AI models. So could you explain what you meant by that comment and how worried we should be about that?
Yeah, so we actually stole that quote from, we had a lot of whistleblower reports in the process of putting together this action plan. There's a gap at some of these labs between what you'll hear from the admittedly publicly concerned executives. Like you hear Sam Altman testify before Congress, you hear other folks do the same. They are expressing a level of concern that is meaningful and significant. The course of action that they recommend is sometimes not aligned with, and you'd expect this in a big organization, right? This is like some big revelation. But certainly we spoke to a lot of whistleblowers who in one case, framed things as, yes, this game of Russian roulette. As you scale these systems, again, dollars in or compute in, IQ points out this very rough picture that is wrong in interesting ways, but at least wrong in interesting ways. As you scale your system, you get more IQ points. But those IQ points don't tell you what the system will actually be able to do, right? Will GPT 4.5, the next kind of level of scale, will that allow us to do all the things that the London Stock Exchange wants to do, right? Will it allow us to finally solve problem X, Y, or Z? No one actually knows. We get to build the system, sit back, and find out. And it's in that sense that researchers at these labs have called this out as essentially a game of Russian roulette as they see it being played out internally. Let's build the system, see if it's kind of dangerously creative. If we give it access to enough tools, will bad stuff start to happen? No one really knows, and there is no theoretical foundation, no theoretical basis on which we can make that extrapolation reliably. So that's sort of the context of that quote, yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, and now speculating on the kind of the long-term future of this, and like what that might mean and what potential safeguards could be. Emily, what do you think some of the long-term implications of all of this will be to the financial sector as we know it today?
Oh, predicting the future. I think it is in this one particularly hard to say exactly, but what I will say, some things that I feel fairly confident on. I do think that we are going to see people empowered with much greater access to information. And you can draw analogies to the calculator and the internet and many other things. I think that is true. I think you will also see an opportunity for people to be better equipped in terms of the intent of the task that they are trying to perform. And I think those two things together will be radical in of themselves to financial services. I think one thing that I'm less sure of is what is the impact in terms of AI is not a finance phenomenon. So what is the impact from a broader perspective in terms of some of the changes that are happening from an AI perspective, and how do we make sure that we preserve the integrity, the intent, the safety within financial services to ensure that stable operation? I think that is one of the key things where we're taking a very careful, stepwise approach. But I do think, and actually reflecting on something someone else said yesterday, where we saw things like cloud as background technology, this is foreground technology. maybe also background too. And that's not something we've seen historically. So I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say what that looks like, but some of the things that I'm speaking to are some of the tangible examples that we're already starting to see play through. But I do think at the forefront, and building on some of the points Jeremie was making, the need for literacy around AI and understanding it not in the context of deeply necessarily within the model, although people are very welcome to, but really practically, what does it mean for the solution you're trying to build, how to make it safe, how to put the right guardrails on it, how to stop certain things happening where you don't view them as desirable is so critical. And finding a scalable way to get that level of understanding literacy out across the industry is of paramount importance.
And I mean, you know, you spend time with staff trying to indeed increase literacy on these topics. Are there kind of practical things you could recommend, like in terms of maybe some of the people here as well, right? About how to kind of, it's a very complex topic, right? And so how should people engage with it? And
it is, but I think it's probably one of the most well-written topics that exists on YouTube and Coursera and so many other places. And these are free courses that people can take up. There's a huge number of experts who are more than eager and passionate to discuss. So I think this is one of those things where it is truly an example of learn, unlearn, and relearn. And if people lean into it, the answers are there. But we need people to lean into this and really understand, not in a general abstract way, but what does it mean for your organization? What does it mean for the problems you're solving for? And take that position and make sure that we're putting the safeguards in.
great. And they can listen to your podcast as well, right? And Jeremie, just kind of picking up on what you were saying before about some of the kind of long-term risks and the systemic risks, and we'll be hearing from some central bank governors later on today about kind of how they view AI risk and what they might be doing about it. But just maybe you could kind of, in practical terms, in the kind of months and years ahead, for people working in this field to try and ensure that they are doing what they can to help with alignment and safety, and you know, we hear this term like responsible AI. What are the kind of things that people can and should be doing?
Yeah, it's a challenging question in some ways, because the sorts of systems that you need to be working with day to day in order to make the kinds of advances that make a difference at the very frontier. When we're talking about power seeking, like I'm not talking about, you know, the AI system that the local startup is going to put together with a $500,000 budget or something, right? We're talking about like the frontier systems. And building the safeguards that will work for those systems requires access to those systems. It's very difficult to contribute to those frontier risks without, you know, taking measures that require access. However, there are other categories of risk that are very significant. Weaponization is another one that we covered in that investigation, that action plan. This is essentially the risk that AI systems could be weaponized, you know, by malicious actors to take down critical infrastructure, elements of the, you know, financial system, so on and so forth. I think one of the most important things to do in that context is to be aware of like what is the art of the possible. Right? Fraud obviously is top of mind right now, but as we build systems that are capable of executing multiple linked, chained together sequences of actions that are coherent, you know, you start to think about things like cyber agents. We just saw a paper, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, where like one-day vulnerabilities were exploited by an AI system that saw them for the first time. Basically like a description of a vulnerability that was made public, which, by the way, is going to be shared and unpatched in many, many systems around the world. And a version of OpenAI's GPT-4 was just able to take that and use it to successfully execute these non-trivial attacks, something like 75% of the time. Right? That's today, that's at this level of scale. It's the worst these systems will ever be. Right? So I think one aspect is just being aware of what is in the art of the possible. A lot of what we do, so we have contracts with the US National Security Community, Department of Defense on training specifically, and a big theme there, it's all for kind of non-technical audiences, so it's not about understanding the guts, it's understanding what's coming next, right? So you level set, okay, here's where we are today, here's how scaling works, here's what systems like ChatGPT are, blah, 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 fine. But coupled to that, you must add a horizon scanning function. What has happened in the last few months that completely changes the art of the possible? It's not that it'll be incorporated tomorrow, right? But you need some lead time to respond to it. Just because regulations don't accommodate it today, culture doesn't accommodate it today, does not mean that we get to sit back and wait for this vanguard to actually hit us. We have this blessed gap between the art of the possible becoming possible and when it's actually implemented. We ought to use that time to prepare ourselves, to figure out how we can use it and so on and so forth. So I think that delta or that gap is really, really crucial. And there are a lot of ways you can fill it. But yes, having some kind of horizon scanning function, I think organizationally is really important.
I took something in common from both of you there about this. So it seemed to be about kind of just educating ourselves, being literate on these technologies and indeed understanding what the art of the possible is. We'll probably have time for just one or two questions right at the end. But just to wrap up, I have to ask you, what are we going to be talking about this time next year?
Emily?
Agents.
She stole my answer. I'll just add a level of detail that Emily was already thinking when she said agents, I'm sure. A key metric, so by agents, right, this is like take ChatGPT and give it a complex instruction like make me an Airbnb clone app that can help me rent out my garage. And then it'll list out the tasks involved in accomplishing that and farm out each of those subtasks to another version of itself for autonomous execution. That's roughly speaking what we mean by agent. The number of those tasks that you can chain together coherently is we're still trying to come up with the right way to express that. We kind of call it the task coherence length, so the number of chain tasks that an agent can actually handle. Tends to scale with the context window that Emily was talking about earlier. That's a number, really, really key number to look out for. If context windows go the way they have been going, I think that number could actually really explode in the next year, and then we start to see these systems doing very impressive things autonomously.
Okay. Agents. I would have said agents as well.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what is your answer?
Agents. Yeah. That's a cheap way out. All right, so I think we've got time for one or two questions. The lady there in the middle, I think you were first.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. And I'm Camilla from the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And especially thinking about this, what could be possible down the line. So we're talking here about innovation around tokenization and then AI. One is we don't know what's true, and with tokenization, this shared truth. We're not talking a lot about quantum computing, and one will make AI even more powerful, and the other one has the possibility of compromise. How much do you talk about quantum computing, and how much should we talk about it?
And I know you know something about quantum computing, right? Didn't you write a book on that?
It wasn't a good book. So yeah, I'm a lapsed quantum physicist. And so I guess one thing about quantum computing, scale matters, right? We just talked about this idea of like compute goes in, IQ points come out. So if you can find a source of compute that radically increases the inputs to that also accelerates the outputs. So I think one way to think of that is just as a wild card. Not all algorithms are quantum compatible. Not all algorithms can benefit from the quantum lift, but people have found ways to reverse engineer all the regular AI ones or a lot of them. So yeah, you ought to expect a big lift. When that happens, couldn't tell you, crystal ball territory, no idea. But a feedback loop is already forming, where AI systems are being used to help design better quantum computers. And this is true of classical computers too. So, and then those chips are being fed back in to accelerate our AI progress. I expect that loop to tighten more and more and more over time, whether it's classical, quantum, or both. So I think an unsatisfactory answer to your excellent question is wild card. Yeah.
Let me just add a little bit. I think while something may be possible doesn't make it true. And what I mean by that is there is already a gap between what is technically possible and the reality. And I don't see that converging necessarily to be one. I think we will always live in a scenario where there's going to be constant innovations happening in different fields that are beacons of things that could be. And we will choose of whether to elect or not. And so we will create decision points and deterministic actions that allow us to create the right levels of control, transparency, society within. And I think that will, particularly in the next chapter, I'm talking about what's coming, I think we will definitely see the speed of investment happening around the research on AI in particular is so vast, and quantum computing, that we're going to see more pressure in terms of that gap, but we will ultimately normalize into a place where we start to elect in and we have the frameworks around it. So I do think that both coexist. I don't think that we have to be at the forefront of technology to define where we are as a society.
Great. Other questions? Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Leon Schumacher. I have another question around cybersecurity. We have many central banks that plan to launch offline payment systems. Now, full offline is mathematically impossible to secure. So when these things come out in 27, 28, how long do you guess that it will take AI to make them fall? Minutes, hours, days?
I'm so confident about this answer. Emily?
All you.
Well, maybe the one way of addressing this question is to think about kind of, you touched on some of the risks, like with misalignment, and we've heard of like misinformation and disinformation, things like that. So there are some very real, and using AIs to generate code, for example. I think you talked about some recent research where they used AI to exploit published security vulnerabilities, for example. So maybe one way of addressing that question is about like how real is that at the moment, right? Using AI already to kind of try and identify and exploit vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, I'm not making light of the question. It's an amazing question, right? It's just, it goes to show, like, I don't know where the experts are, but they're somewhere hopefully on that issue. On cyber, I think this question of agents that we've talked about a few times and the task coherence length, that really is the key metric in so many things, cyber included, right? You think about penetrating any given system requires a large number of sequenced actions that are all coherent, all in pursuit of a single coherent end goal. How long it takes for those exploits to actually work will depend on the exploit, depend on the system, depend on almost everything. But I think by the time you get to asking about a specific system, probably, like usually it's the case that the systems that we think are most vulnerable turn out to actually be a little bit lower down in the priority order, and there are low-hanging fruit elsewhere that get picked off first. A lot of the sort of social engineering type attacks are looking really promising today, right? So you think about identity theft, people spoofing voices and all that stuff. We've already seen that work. That's going to roll out. I mean, I'm comfortable just putting my chips on this. That's going to roll out at a very significant scale over the coming months, but certainly years. So you think about like what you can do with access to kind of human capital and being able to manipulate people. I think that's like there's a whole salad of different options there. That's a terrible metaphor, but that get us to sort of concerning risk classes there. I think ultimately, early warning about early indications of penetration, and coupled with pen testing and red teaming, those sorts of things, sort of become necessary. You need to take more of a defense in depth approach because the attack surface is so huge, right? And it's just impractical to expect to be able to cover all the bases.
I think one thing, Jeremy, you've said in the past is good AI for bad AI as well, which I think you kind of coined quite nicely. It's not as though we're equipped with the same capabilities and tools we were 10 years ago. And this is part of what we're saying. If people lean into it and use it in the right way, we can actually set ourselves up in a way that we are equally prepared to be able to analyze, to track, preempt where those things are, where those vulnerabilities may exist, and take action preemptively.
That's a great point, yeah. And that attack defense surface area also starts to matter a lot there too, right? Like, how much smarter does the attacking or defending AI have to be to neutralize each other? And that depends on the system, right? So you look at the world, it's this very large surface. You can do a lot of damage with a pretty dumb AI, right? So how large is your system? How many parts of it are not provably secure, right? These start to become the important ingredients that factor into your kind of defense strategy, yeah.
We have to wrap up there. The big screen at the front is telling us we've run out of time. So thank you very much to both of my panelists for sharing your fascinating insights. Thank you.